It's time for the Bible Geek.
Robert M. Christ. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not.
Holy Ghost.
God, Gnostic, God blasted my spine.
Ghost.
Yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Interpretation, Startle, Jesus, homiletical, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Robert M. Price here, back after a bit of a hiatus while I've been working like crazy on Holy Fable. Just finished my draft of Philippians today, so I got a few more Pauline and pseudo-Pauline epistles, and then I'm going to tackle the Gospels, and then the general epistles, and the book of Revelation. So as you can see, I still got quite a bit to do, and I am trying to stick to it as much as I can, but I hate neglecting the Bible Geek. So, I want to answer some questions. I got quite a backlog here, and let me remind you folks that I have lost the adjunct position I had with Johnny Coleman because of their budget shrinking, and this pokes quite a hole in the old Price family budget. Some of you have been of great help. I want to thank you for that and encourage anybody else that is in a position to do so to do so. But there's no admission charge. Don't worry about that. Okay, let's get to those questions. This from the famous Meher Shalal Hashbaz's nephew. He says, two questions. One, can you say something about the Greek words used in the New Testament for spirit and ghost? The Old English and the Anglican prayer books after 1549 has the term Holy Ghost, since corrected to Holy Spirit as the third person of the Trinity. Is there anything to be said about this in the Greek? Is the word used for Holy Spirit related to ghosties? Only in the sense that the older New Testament and liturgical usage simply reflected general usage, because the word ghost from the German Geist could mean either one, spirit or a returning spirit haunting you. And in fact, there's no difference between Holy Spirit, which uses the word pneuma, spirit, also meaning breath, interchangeably with that for when Jesus is thought to be a spirit or a ghost, as we would differentiate. When he's walking on the water, right? They thought they saw a pneuma, a spirit. And in Luke 24, when he's back from the dead, he says, "Touch me and see, no pneuma, no spirit has flesh and bones as you see me having." So there isn't any difference, though. In Greek, there is another word that in broader Greek literature is also used for ghost, and that would be maybe two of them, in fact. Let's see. Oddly enough, psyche, which we usually translate soul or life, is used for ghost, and even phasma or phantasma, right? Phantom. So those words are used in Greek, though I don't think anywhere in the New Testament. So luckily I happen to have an answer to that one. Okay, two, I was listening to an interesting radio program about the Salem Witch trials, and a historian said that evidence was allowed in the court cases relating to the claimed affliction people suffered by a witch's specter. The accused could not defend themselves by saying that they were not present, to cast the spell immediately, like Maleficent does in Sleeping Beauty, because it was believed that a witch did not need to be near the person. I thought this was quite an odd thing for an extreme Protestant Puritan group to think, Cotton Mather and those guys. Do you have any insights as to where this weird belief in specters might have come from biblically? Or maybe the best explanation is that they just made up a lot of bungo theology on the fly about people they didn't like. I am guessing this is an old folk belief. And, of course, we'd have to guess that it came about. In other words, I don't think this was a theological, polemical invention. I'm guessing this was part of the old tradition, and I bet you there were witches that boasted in their threatening that you better do as I say or I will cause your crops to fail or something like that. She didn't need to be there. She could just broadcast it. And of course, this could be turned back on him in an ideal fashion because it would mean that, lady, you don't have to be on the scene. So I would bet that this is an older thing because witchcraft and the like goes back a good bit earlier than the era of the Puritans and so forth. It's interesting to wonder if the witches of New England, of Massachusetts, were actually witches. From what I remember reading long ago, that a couple of them were from Jamaica and may actually have been involved in witchcraft or juju or whatever you want to call it. That doesn't mean they thought they were having sex with the devil and all that kind of thing, like people are doing in the brand new Lucifer TV series. Anyway, Meher Shalal Hashbad's nephew goes on, I also noted that those who confessed to witchcraft at the trials were usually let off, whereas those who maintained that they hadn't done anything were hanged, which sounds a bit more like the church I know. Yeah, I didn't know that. I figured they had you one way or the other. Interesting point. From William Scott Harkey. Says, are there any theories as to why the ancient Hebrews created a day of absolute rest? God rested after creation, but for the ancient Hebrews living in harder and harsher times, resting seems like a slightly dangerous thing to do, especially when food may have run short. Well, of course, they had a provision for that, William. Like with the story of the manna. It says on the day before the Sabbath you should gather twice as much so you don't have to go out on the Sabbath to get it. And, of course, the implication would be have things ready, have some extra food around, or in the rather extreme way that Hasidic Jews take it, since any effort virtually is work on the Sabbath, or might be, right? You remember the idea of the hedge around the Torah. They knew that no such thing was actually stipulated in the Torah, in the text of Scripture, right? But since it doesn't exactly say what work on the Sabbath would mean, they figured, well, let's play it safe. We don't want to transgress it, so let's stay as far away from the commandment as we can by, avoiding everything that could possibly have been intended. So, as I was saying about the Hasidic approach to toilet paper, you would need to go when on the Sabbath, and so can you tear toilet paper? No, but it can't be that tough to tear an extra heap of it on the day before. So, I think they obviated that one. Now, where did the idea of this day of rest come from? Two sources that I know of, and nobody knows this for sure, but they're pretty good theories. One is that it was borrowed from the Babylonian ill-omened day that happened, I think, every couple of weeks. And the notion there was it would be bad luck to try to do anything, so don't. It wasn't to honor God or anything like that. And of course, the idea that God created the world in 6 work days and then kicked back on the 7th. Well, of course, that's obviously an ideological legend, a ceremonial legend to to reinforce a practice that came up from somewhere else, right? And it may be this Babylonian ill-omened day. Now, what about the seventh day? Well, there is some reason to believe that Amos talks about Israelites worshiping Saturn, under their name for it, when they lived in the wilderness. And Saturn is the seventh planet on the ancient enumeration. And so they thought that, it is on ours too, right? No, it's not. No. Anyway, it's they thought it was, because the planets for them were the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, and Saturn. Well, if they worshipped Saturn, then Saturn's day would be Saturday. Now, I know that's what Saturday means. It comes from Latin, right? Saturn's day. But still, it'd be the same thing. Saturday would be Saturn's day. No work in honor of the god. Presumably, you're to spend all day worshiping him or whatever. So that's as far as I know where it comes from. It most likely did not mean to prohibit any activity at all, but rather just working for wages. Later Jews, like in New Testament times, for instance, on the question of whether you could heal on the Sabbath, for which Jesus catches a lot of flack in the Gospels, that's one reason to think that there's something wrong with those stories, because from everything else we know about Jewish tradition, they said if you were healing somebody by prayer or by magic, that's okay. You just can't get paid for it. I believe also if somebody was in danger of death, well, to heck with a Sabbath, help them. But generally speaking, you didn't work for a living. But again, they weren't sure. They didn't want to take any chances with obeying the word of God. So eventually, you're doing nothing. Same thing happened with the Christian Sunday, by the way. Constantine made Sunday a day of no work so that Christian slaves and employees could get to church. And it was much and some Christians were still going to synagogue on Sabbath as well. It was only later on that they stopped going to synagogue and they kind of transferred the Sabbath commandment to Sunday, the Lord's Day, commemorating the resurrection, though already a holy day among the Mandeans who venerated the sun in the sky. And eventually Sunday became the Sabbath in the full sense, no work. Right? Calvinists were big on that. If you've seen the terrific flick Chariots of Fire, you know how much that meant to him. It was a crisis of conscience for Eric Liddell to run the Olympics on the Sabbath. He wasn't getting paid for it, but what's the difference? They were real Sabbatarians. Same thing happened in Islam when Friday was the day of prayer. Originally, it wasn't a day when work was forbidden, but it eventually became that. So, sort of a pattern. I don't know if Buddhists or Hindus have a Sabbath or not. Interesting question. Okay, Reed Braden from Richmond, Virginia says, have you heard anyone suggest that maybe Abraham failed his test when God asked him to kill Isaac? Abraham and God directly conversed multiple times before this command to sacrifice Isaac. If I've counted right, it's 7 times, and why would it be such a significant number if the number wasn't pointing to something significant? This one time, Abe doesn't protest, he doesn't object, he doesn't question or ask for clarification. He refuses to talk to God, he lies to his kid. God'll provide the lamb. And then he coerces him to his place of execution. God was even going to let Abraham do it. He was willing to fail Abraham so hard on this test that he himself would go from being the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to being the God of that schmuck who killed off his progeny. It was an angel intervening on humanity's behalf that stopped the murder, not God. Well, you got to remember it says angel of Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh. So I think there's reason to go with the traditional view that God sent him. Anyway, it suddenly seems to me that God was testing his servant's free will. He was trying to ascertain if his servant was becoming too servile, if maybe he should dial back the awesomeness when talking to humans in the future for fear of turning them into mindless automatons. And he does dial it back after Abraham, no more child sacrifice. So by simply accepting the task, Abe failed the test. And maybe God was testing himself a little too, and testing how he communicates with his servants and the effects he might be having on their ability to exercise free will. And if he was doing that, it seems he also must have considered himself as failing the test. Otherwise, why would he gradually become more and more subtle when speaking to his servants? If he invented free will, the last thing he'd want to do is rob his most important people of the chance to exercise it. Any thoughts? Am I crazy? Yes, I have to admit you're crazy. No, I'm kidding. But I find that ingenious, but it seems to me to be doing what fundamentalists do and reading later theology about free will and stuff like that into an ancient story where the author couldn't really have had issues like that in mind. So I would say it's kind of fascinating, but I very much doubt if that could be the intention of the writer, though we don't know, right? Can't call him up and ask him. Keep up the good thinking. Oh, let's see. I think this one, which is kind of long, is from Jason Quackenbush. And let's see. Yeah, he says, I've been reading about the textual history of the Epistle of James, and I hope you might answer a few questions regarding its authorship. The most obvious attribution of the letter, it seems to me, is to James the Just. In fact, I suspect that any second-century Christian reader would presume that it was a letter from the first bishop of Jerusalem. And being persuaded by Herr Dr. Traubisch that the Catholic letters were assembled by Polycarp as part of his first edition New Testament, then it follows by Traubisch's logic that Polycarp likely either believed the Epistle of James was an authentic letter of James the Just, or he believed it was so clearly representative of his views and could be fairly attributed to him, and his readers would accept it. Do you think that's a fair inference? Yeah, I mean, it's possible, since on Traubisch's view, which I accept too, that Polycarp was looking for some other apostolic letters to balance off the Marcionite focus on Paul. And he figured, if I can find letters with that people think John wrote, or that it's said that Peter or James wrote, or Jude, well, let's just assume that they're the New Testament characters of those names. And who knows, maybe he thought that was some sort of an argument that they were. You never know. I mean, religious people often kind of feel like, well, God wouldn't leave us without an answer to this question, so let's flip a coin, and that's got to be it. So it's hard to say exactly what he's thinking, but it did come in handy given his motivation as we infer it. Okay, I believe there are good reasons to believe the latter, that it has been taken from another source and slightly redacted to appear Christian. For one, it appears possible in the English translations to remove all references to Jesus Christ by name without changing the meaning. If you do so, the rest of the letter appears to speak only of the Lord, using kurios in the Greek. I understand that kurios was used in Hellenized Judaica as the appropriate gloss on the Tetragrammaton, similar to the Hebrew usage of Adonai. Of course, I don't speak Greek, so I'm unsure if this is just as true of the original as it is of the translations. But if it is the case, the Epistle of James might be read as thoroughly Jewish and possibly pre-Christian, and indeed it might be read as thoroughly Jewish and possibly... Wait a minute. Let me start that one over. But if it is the case, the Epistle of James might be read as thoroughly Jewish and possibly pre-Christian, and indeed it could be read as representing a thoroughly Jewish legalism of a sort that seems to be associated with the Essene desert monasteries that Eisenman associates with James the Just by way of Qumran. This latter observation, though, would seem to strengthen the associations of James the Just as its author, do they not? As a result of this chain of thought, I've come back around to the idea that perhaps it is only a lightly redacted or even unredacted copy of an authentic writing of James. Because of that, I've been reading through various arguments in favor of it being either pseudepigraphical or otherwise anonymous, and I have to say I find them lacking, and I would very much like your take on them. The argument that I've seen most often is that the Greek of the epistle is far too sophisticated for a Jerusalemite Jew to have written. I find this sort of argument unpersuasive for the same reason I find lacking the arguments that Revelation must have been written by John the Apostle because the Greek style is so poor. It seems extremely unsound to jump from the perceived level of education of a writer to assumptions about who that writer might be, particularly when we have no idea how poorly or well educated they might have been. So in the end, these arguments go nowhere. We can assume that James is an unlettered carpenter from Galilee who somehow rises to prominence in Jerusalem, and therefore the work of a well-educated man can't be him. Well, actually, that sounds pretty good to me. But at the same time, we have what appears to be a copy of an autograph saying it's from James and written in literate Greek. And if we assume that it is what it says it is, all we must do is give up this picture of James as the unschooled Galilean, a proposition for which in the end we have only very poor evidence. What saith the Bible, Geek, about these arguments from style? It seems to me that for the most part they are little more than apologetics working in favor of foregone conclusions, but aren't particularly illuminating otherwise. Is there any good reason to believe that James the Just wasn't just as well educated in Greek as his Jewish contemporaries like Philo of Alexandria or Josephus? Let's see. I have to say that though the evidence is sketchy, it's better than no evidence, and it does nudge me in the direction of saying that this couldn't very well be the work of James the Jewish zealot, zealous for Judaism, as we read him. Now, of course, the whole reconstruction of who James the Just was is a matter of scotch taping together a few clues here and there, some of them of dubious value, just bits of tradition and so on. So anyway you approach it, this whole thing is a house of cards. St. Jerome didn't think James the Just wrote it. He thought it was pseudepigraphical, though he didn't reject it for that reason. But I believe he put it that he thought an admirer of James wrote it in his name. And apparently that wasn't considered all that scandalous, at least not by everybody. I mean, people that had reason to deny certain authorship because they wanted to deny a certain idea mentioned in it of any clout, they might have taken umbrage or pretended to. I think that's kind of what's going on when Eusebius disses the book of Revelation as written by the elder John, because look, the Apostle John couldn't have written that piece of junk. He didn't like the millenarianism, the chiliasm of it, so he couldn't have an apostle writing that. In fact, authorship claims in New Testament works were often rejected, or apocryphal works, as they turned out, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and so on, because the Catholic theologians, clergy, whatever, didn't like what they said, so they simply couldn't be from real apostles. So who the heck knows, really? I would say the probability, thin though it be, is on the side of saying, yeah, James couldn't have written this. Another reason to think so is the apparent stoicism in it. The part that at first sight appears to be legalism, where it says, look, you can't ignore one commandment, and whichever one it is. You obey thou shalt not kill, that's a toughie, right? But other things you think you can dismiss? No. If you keep the law, you're keeping the whole thing. You can't just keep a part of it. That sounds very much like Matthew 5:17 through 19, right, about breaking the least of these commandments. But it also sounds an awful lot like Stoicism, where they said you can't consider yourself righteous if you're not completely righteous. Well, who knows? Is this Hellenistic Judaism? Is it even supposed to be James, the brother of the Lord, whatever that meant? I don't know. The Stoicism and the Greek style do seem to me to militate against it. And yet, if you go with Eisenman, as I do on most of this, you can say there is nonetheless a real connection to James the Just, the teacher of righteousness of the Qumran sect. He identifies the two, I think, very plausibly. And that is because he thinks that the Epistle of James and the Epistle of Jesus to Abgarus, I think I got that right, are both inspired by the so-called MMT, the Dead Sea Scroll, which is a letter to a Gentile king. About if his people convert to Judaism, here's what they have to do, and it's kind of a mini Torah. And that James is kind of like that. It's aimed at Christians who want to keep the law and who live in the diaspora across the Mediterranean. Jesus isn't mentioned much, but if the Qumran sect was the Jerusalem church, that shouldn't be too surprising. We wouldn't have the same Christological focus we would as if it were Johannine or Pauline. By the way, the great J.C. O'Neill, in an essay he had in the Journal of Higher Criticism, argued that Hebrews also never mentioned Jesus, that there are hints in the manuscript tradition that all the occurrences of Jesus have been added, and that originally it was about the teacher of righteousness. Fascinating. But I'd have to refer you to if you have my pre-Nicene New Testament or my Human Bible New Testament, take a look at the introductions to Hebrews and to James, and I think that'll go into my views a little more in detail. Anyway, returning to Jason, he says, the other argument that seems common is that James has parallels to documents we know to be later, such as 1 Clement and the Shepherd of Hermas, and that therefore it is anachronistic to place it during the lifetime of James the Just. This seems to be reading too much into the text of the epistle to me, which in general doesn't seem tied to specific practices in the Christian church, but rather seems almost like a lecture to God-fearing Gentiles about how to properly follow the Noahide laws, the handful of laws given to Noah after the flood for the whole human race. Specifically of importance here is the fact that there is no direct appeal to the covenant with Moses or circumcision, despite repeated references to the law, or as Judge Dredd would say, the law. And all the specifics cited seem to be part of the Noahic laws. Indeed, sexual immorality and greed or covetousness seem to be the big sins that James is worried about, rather than ritual purity or other aspects of temple worship. As such, these ideas don't seem at all anachronistic and seem to be something that would have been a constant part of Judaism from the moment the rules for Gentile God-fearers were formalized, which I believe dates well into pre-Christian times. Yeah, all that sounds pretty kosher to me. The fallout, I think, is that we have to take seriously the idea that the Epistle of James is exactly what it claims to be, and if so, and particularly if the mentions of Jesus Christ are not later insertions, it could very well be very instructive about the nature of the early church in Jerusalem. What it was like in a manner that hasn't been wholly appreciated by scholarship. What say you? Well, yeah, and I would say except by Robert Eisenman. And there are a few other books that are pretty much dependent on Eisenman that make this pretty clear too. In fact, Eisenman, he naturally doesn't claim to be the first to come up with this. There was a whole series of articles in I think the Journal of Jewish Studies back in the 50s or so that argued, I can't think of the Jacob Teicher, I believe it was, Teicher. I could be wrong, it might be Teichner, sticking the N in there. But he argues at great length in many articles that really should be published as a book that the Dead Sea Scrolls represent the Jerusalem church. And that's kind of my assumption. And if you want to, but actually that doesn't exclude much of what is said about the Qumran sect. It just gives it a name. And so pretty interesting. Okay, thanks, Jason. This is your most humble servant, Waleed from Newcastle, UK. I was got the wrong accent here. I was just wondering why bother ironing out the anachronisms of Jesus' genealogy if there's a perfectly plausible solution. Using the apologetics the apologetics method, all accounts are correct and each evangelist wrote from his own angle, I suggest, why can't Mary have two boyfriends? Joseph Heli, as Matthew knew, and Joseph Jacob, who was known in Luke's neighborhood, and who both dated her simultaneously. Perhaps the Holy Lady had a soft spot for carpenters. So I was considering... wait a minute. I think this is another letter here. I'm sorry. Yes, it is. Okay. There's something like this in the Toledoth Yeshu, which says that Mary was not knowingly unfaithful to Joseph, but on a dark night was tricked into thinking this guy, Pandera, Roman soldier, was Joseph, and slept with him, and he was the biological father of Jesus. She found this out only later, when she was found to be pregnant, and Joseph said, hey, it couldn't be mine. But Joseph understood the situation and married her anyway. I don't know if you could possibly wrangle it to consider either of the gospel genealogies that of Pandera, though Epiphanius of Salamis did think that Pandera was the name of one of Jesus' ancestors, which he wedged into one of those genealogies gratuitously. Pretty bizarre. I think you're coming close to the view of Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, breakaway from Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. Because, and this is the ultimate harmonization, he said that the genealogies and even the nativity stories of Luke and Matthew are about two different guys, two different kids named Jesus. One of them was the reincarnation of King Solomon, the other of the prophet Zoroaster. And at some point, one of them died. I think it was the Solomon Jesus, and his spirit went over into the body of the Zoroaster Jesus so that he had both of them knocking around in there, which may sound utterly bizarre, and it is, but actually something like that is held to be true about various Mahayana Buddhist lamas, that they are the recipients of the tulkus, the transformation bodies of more than one of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So it's, in comparative religion terms, it's It's not that weird, though you'd have a hard time showing that such a category was available to the early Christians. Unless this is another piece of evidence for the Buddhist origins of Christianity, a la Christian Lindner, though of course Lindner would not feel obliged to accept anything Steiner said, who I regard as kind of a mad genius. But pretty good. It's not as if apologetics theories are not weird enough, but once you start thinking that way, who knows what kind of genie's going to come out of that lamp. Okay, this is from Asa H., who suggests a Kentucky accent, but despite hearing Rand Paul interminably, and what's that guy's name in the Mitch McConnell, they're Kentuckians, but it doesn't stick with me. Anyway, so I was considering how much language was generated by the works of Shakespeare and wondering if it would even be possible to roughly track through classical history the meaning and cultural impact of stories, myths, religious allegories, and memes. To clarify, when we take words and phrases from Shakespeare's writing and make that part of a common language, presumably it affects how we look at the world. Apparently Shakespeare had the pop appeal to infect the English-speaking world with many new words and phrases that are still around. That is how memes work. Information spread in a viral way. Certainly religion isn't all that different. Has anyone ever researched how many prayers, myths, and stories took root in different cultures in antiquity? For example, I was just reading something today in Abraham Mallarby's book, Paul and the Popular Philosophers, where he said how Paul's that the Israelites, in 1 Corinthians he says the Israelites ate and drank and rose up to play. And he said that phrase was supposed to be engraved on the tombstone of the Assyrian emperor Sardanapalus, who was used as the paradigm of sybaritic, hedonistic living. And it's that would be a kind of an example of how something struck people's fancy. And eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Anyway, let's see. For example, the Old Testament's precise notation about temple construction is very similar to the Babylonians' temple construction. I believe I've read that there are Egyptian and Phoenician prayers for the health of family and children that would be similar in tone to passages in the Bible. Oh, that's true, by the way, of various Assyrian and Babylonian and other psalms. You'd think you were reading the Bible, and we've got plenty of this stuff, amazingly. Okay, just as Proto-Indo-European language groups have certain fundamental similarities between myths, great book on that is Comparative Mythology by, Jan Pouvel. Great book on that very thing. Oh boy, I'm sorry about that. Just as Proto-Indo-European language groups have certain fundamental similarities between myths, certainly the Semitic Phoenicians that gave the ancient Greeks their alphabet also traded cultural influences. Oh, you bet they did. Look at Berosus, a Babylonian priest who records myths that either were also used by the writers of Genesis or they got it from him, as has been argued recently. Okay, sorry about that minor interruption. That darn phone, why'd they ever invent it? Cultural references, Bible stories. Did any of the Bible stories come out of the Semitic world into the broader world, Middle Eastern world, Greeks, Egyptians, the diverse Mediterranean peoples were trading partners? Yeah, they certainly did. There's a lot of good stuff on that in the book Hebrew Myths, the book of Genesis by Raphael Patai and Robert Graves. Has anyone brought academic rigor to compiling a list of cultural similarities in that sphere of influence and trade relationships? I'm sure they have. I'm not up on that, really, but I would recommend as a starter that book, Hebrew Myths. Perhaps it's impossible to clearly draw inferences between different languages and cultures from so very long ago. However, to think of spiritual and cultural traditions as mimetic information traveling among ancient traders is a fascinating idea that I'm sure someone more patient than I has researched. Is it possible the trade networks of the Phoenician city-states influenced their southern cousins in Israel and Judea? Did traces of Egyptian conquest leave cultural references and religious ideas and prayers? Did the authors of the Bible and the biblical traditions trade much with the outer world? Do scholars think there was a proto-Jewish diaspora of traders prior to Alexander the Great? Yeah, the prophets mention the scattered people, and they don't seem to be talking about the Babylonian exile, which is much overrated historically. Yeah, I don't think anybody denies the flood stories. There's all kinds of stuff. Part of a chapter of Proverbs is borrowed from the Egyptian wisdom text, the wisdom of Amenemophet, and there's really no chance that it's not. It appears that the more people read about ancient people, the less mysterious and isolated they were from each other. Although ancient kingdoms and city-states are often studied and categorized in academic silos, the more we study, the more human and dynamic their trading routes become. If we assume that the ancients had common sense, then a good idea is a good idea in any language. It wouldn't shock me if the historical record is too distorted and fragmented, for example, from the period of Ugarit to the writing of the Old Testament, that it is impossible to track who first made up which character and who first told which prayer. Though you can date these sources pretty readily in many cases, and that would give us a pretty good clue, I think. However, finding the borrowings between religious traditions is a great example of how humanity is all very similar, which academics have studied and summarized the way different cultural groups have adopted, transferred, transplanted ideas and religious motifs. Once again, great book called Mythology Among the Hebrews by Ignaz, I-G-N-A-Z, Goldziher, G-O-L-D-Z-I-H-E-R. Mythology Among the Hebrews gives all kinds of cross-references. Stuff by Nick Wyatt, W-Y-A-T-T. It's very literate about all these comparative things. There's really an industry about that. I would check out the Bible and comparative religion as a topic on some search service and see what's up. Thanks, King Asa. Lachlan says, it was the list of common English sayings from the Bible in Dawkins's The God Delusion that convinced me that if I didn't read the Bible, I would be damned to an eternity of cultural illiteracy. Thus, I was surprised to learn John the Baptist saw himself unfit to untie Jesus' sandals. I've always heard, including on the Bible Geek, the phrase in the reverse, that it's about tying, not loosening the laces. What happened? A change in footgear? A cultural shift from ritual fixation on feet to a culture where upper-class individuals have servants to help them dress? Let's see. Let's just take a look at that. You raise an interesting question about something I've long taken for granted. I'm probably just imprecise in my memory quotes of this stuff, but let's see. What's Matthew got? Whose sandals I am not worthy to carry. That's interesting. Mark. Let's see. The thong of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. This is, like, anyway, cut it, menial servant work. That's certainly the point of it. Let's see. Luke. Let's see. This is you brood of vipers. Whose sandals I'm not worthy to untie. I don't think there's anything like that in John. So yeah, pretty interesting. Either carry or untie. I guess I'm just losing my grip, and probably have said tie when it should have been untie, but I guess a slave would do either one. Okay, he or she, forgive me, Lachlan, I'm not familiar with your name and don't know from your comments whether you're male or female, so please set me straight on that. Lachlan says, on a related note, in the New Testament, are feet really feet, or is this a continuation of the Old Testament use of feet as a metaphor for that which Yahweh demanded be circumcised? I've heard that discussed. I don't think there's any reason to think so, though it does make you wonder what some Gnostics might have thought was going on when the woman anointed Jesus' feet and things like that. But I don't think anybody thinks that that's the case. I don't know. I assume it was still used in Hebrew, but then would the Greek Gospels use that? I don't know. Good question. Acapulco J says, let's see, requesting Alfred Hitchcock. My question today is about the trial or trials of Jesus. Mark has a trial with the Jewish council and with Pilate. The time is strange as it is before the Passover and in the evening. Matthew added details of the trial and added Pilate's wife's dream of Jesus' trial. This is going to be too long. That's too slow, so let me switch over to James Mason. Luke triples the trial narrative and adds Herod Antipas. John adds to the trial's narrative, making it 1,400 words. John changes the details of the trial with no reference to false witnesses, no tearing of garments, no nighttime convening of the council, no morning. In fact, James Mason plays one of the Sanhedrinists in the TV movie Jesus of Nazareth. No questions about whom Jesus claimed to be, and no verdict of deserving death. John also adds a high priest, Annas, to the trial. With such a varied reporting of a trial of the most important figure in Christianity, how can it all be true? Also, does this prove that Mark's Gospel was written first due to the brevity of his trial narrative, which then Matthew, Luke, and John embellished in their Gospels? Very confusing, and to quote Mark Twain, the best cure for Christianity is reading the Bible. Well, I think you're right that the other Gospels do seem to be working basically from Mark and embellishing it and changing it. You could argue, and it has been argued, that Mark has abbreviated some version of some longer version in the same way that Matthew's Gospel repeats stories out of Mark, but condenses them because he's got to make room for a whole lot more material that Mark didn't have. I think it is basically Mark and everybody else embellishing, and that does really, among other things, undercut the historicity of the thing. I mean, the very fact that they're having this trial on Passover Eve, it's not just that you weren't supposed to convene court on Passover Eve. It's just these guys, should have been home with their families. I mean, this is the sacred night. What the heck? Sorry, honey, you're going to have to deal with the gefilte fish because I got a trial to go. Who's the lawbreaker here? It just seems, I mean, it's pointless, right? Was Jesus such a threat to these people that one day made a difference? It just seems ridiculous. Plus, the charge against him that that he claims to be the Son of God, this seems to be an anachronism. This represents polemics in the era when Christianity has become, in effect, a Gentile religion of a second God. And Jews are saying, oh my gosh, that's blasphemy. But if Jesus is simply claiming to be the Son of God in the sense of the Messiah, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it remains to be seen whether he is or not. Simon Bar Kokhba claimed to be the Messiah. And some thought he was, some thought he wasn't, but that didn't make him a blasphemer when he failed. Right, and some even apparently thought he was the suffering Messiah, so he was a true Messiah. I think that, and the fact that it changes so much, you got to wonder what the heck happened. What did anybody know about it? Maybe a fat lot of nothing. I mean, even if there was a trial, are we sure anybody was present that would have spilled the beans later? It's just seems highly dubious. The whole idea of harmonizing these things is already to admit that they're not good evidence. You've got to launder the narratives to make it look like they are. Well, that just shows they aren't. Come on. This is... Oh boy, this is very long but tempting. This is from Name Withheld to Keep Away the People with Straight Jackets. Yeah, I have a hard time dodging them, too. Reading the amazing book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle, has not only answered some other questions I had on the origin of Christianity, but has confirmed exactly what I was thinking before I found you and your work. You like stories, so allow me to tell you a small part of mine. Oh, I always enjoy this. I was not raised a Christian, and am not now, nor have I ever been one. It just never made any sense, this dying to cleanse my sin, and how could God only have one son, and what is the big sacrifice if he just becomes Christ in all his glory? While I did not have a religious upbringing, I can say that I did have some experiences growing up that led me to believe there is more to life than just this. Fast forward to now. I'm 52, have a degree in physics, and manage large government contracts in the area of defense and public safety. About 4 years ago, I decided to take my study of the nature of reality a step further and see if there's anything to these stories of psychic ability, spirit guides, and the like by experiencing it. Within 6 months, I was able to prove to myself that this stuff is real. Not just in the sense that Santa Claus is real. He is, it's just not how it is in the books. I was one once, a Santa. But in a very real sense. That is, if you interact in a certain way, you can feel, get images and information from sources that appear to be outside yourself, and get information that was unknown to you at the time. And this Christ thing kept coming up from different sources, none of them Christian. At first, this made me uncomfortable, but the feeling was wonderful, and I was able to let down my defenses when I understood that this had nothing to do with traditional Christianity. I will go into detail on all this at some point, but for now I'll tell you how it led me to you and your work. Early on, I found a channeler who expresses a collective consciousness, something like the Abraham of Esther and Jerry Hicks. If you're familiar with that at all, most of the talk and exercises I practice with their guidance has to do with managing your energy, in quotes. That is how we manage our emotions and belief systems. Yes, a belief system is stored in the body as energy. That is why your core beliefs change. You have a physical reaction to it. Between such talks, they will throw out some information meant to lead the subject to a new understanding, a new belief system, that is, a new energy level. the case related to you is when they threw out the word magus and suggested I look into it. This led me to Maurice Magre's Return of the Magi and to the Simon with that title, Simon Magus. After letting that sink in for a while, they said months later to look into Saul. This led me to the idea, no, the belief that this Simon Magus, the father of all heresy, is the historical Paul, or at least the real author of the stuff before it was modified. And then voila, here you are with a scholarly defense of exactly that. Curious that my search did not find you until after I had a new belief, but that is exactly how spirit works. You can't tell anybody, you have to experience it first yourself before you can get it. Interesting stuff. Of course, even I would not take that as proof that I'm right about this, right? I did get it from an external source, namely Hermann Dettering, so I guess you could say I was channeling him. But more power to you. I have to admit, whenever I hear Jerry and Esther Hicks, I feel like jumping out of my skin with that accent and that shtick. We're from another level of being and we're telling you stupid humans what's what. I figure, look, Esther, why don't you just drop the routine and tell us what you think? But anyway, that's just my problem. And now to the questions. If I understand you correctly, we agree that Simon Magus is at the root of this belief system advanced by the works of Paul. Stuff about the law and a judging, punishing God are out. So Simon's philosophy and writings would be considered source material. Is there any uncontaminated reminiscence of this belief system? Well, once again, the evidence is meager but suggestive. What Irenaeus says, and I believe he's the one that says that Simon said that we're saved by grace, not by works, and so forth, and what several other church fathers say can be cobbled together, and that's what I did in The Amazing Colossal Apostle, in the chapter The Secret of Simon Magus. And those guys, those church fathers and heresy experts, I would say you'd have to expect them not to take especial care to fairly represent the people they're criticizing. It's very easy to reduce people to straw men, right? But on the other hand, Irenaeus has by far the most fulsome account of what various types of Gnostics believed, and people used to wonder, is he right or is he making this up? Because he doesn't hold back from sarcastically ridiculing their beliefs as absurd. I kind of like that. I mean, that's kind of the approach I take. But it turns out once we got a hold of the Nag Hammadi texts, he was very accurate and must have been reading copies, for instance, of the Apocryphon of John and other stuff. So I guess he had the wits to realize if this group is still around and you're trying to refute them, you better try to refute what they actually say, or it's going to be mighty easy for them to say, don't listen to that jerk. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Irenaeus did know what he was talking about, and he talks about Simon Magus as a Gnostic, and I think these other writers that mention him, and again, I mentioned some of them in the Secret of Simon Magus, and he appears, of course, in the Acts of Peter and the Clementine homilies and stuff like that, and there you're dealing with fiction, but the fact that they use Simon as a villain makes it worthwhile to see if what else they say that the heresiologists don't say would fit as an extension of it, right? Again, you can't be sure, but those are worthwhile sources to look at. Let's see, which leads me to the second question: how possible is it that the Vatican does hold some of this ancient source material they worked so hard to suppress? I really have no idea. I mean, it's certainly plausible, but I don't. But in the nature of the case, there's no reason to think so. right? If they covered it up in a conspiratorial way and managed to cover their tracks, that means they were successful and there's no surviving evidence, and you can't treat as evidence what might be true. Well, they may have concealed something that says A, B, and C. Well, do you have any documents that, because if you do, we don't need to worry about whether they're also in the Vatican library. So it could be true, but I just don't think there's any particular reason to. It sure would be great if they did and eventually some pope released them or somebody snuck the stuff out. But then you'd have to worry if they're not just to sensationalize or fabricating the stuff. That happens often enough. Okay, that's it for today's Bible Geek. Once again, let me throw away any shred of self-respect and appeal to you hat in hand for some nice donations to help pay the bills, because it's coming to that. If not, don't worry. I want to see you back here next time on the Bible Geek.